The Virginia governor's race is coming to a close. The election is being held next Tuesday. It is the first major competitive election in the United States since President Biden took office. So clearly, the eyes of the nation are on that state, and Democrats and Republicans all across the country are looking to see which factors are driving the electorate and which party they're going to benefit, how those election results in Virginia might reflect on President Biden, how they might reflect on former President Trump, and really especially what those results come Tuesday night might mean for the upcoming midterms all across the country next year. So this week, Politicon is excited to welcome David Byler from the Washington Post. David not only covers the Virginia gubernatorial race for the Post, but he is also the Washington Post's in-house guru when it comes to political statistics and trends. He's their data expert, their political Nostradamus, so to speak. I'll ask him all about the race in Virginia and ask him what that might tell us about the state of American politics writ large. How has a state that was carried by Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, twice by Obama, and has voted for only one Republican governor in the past 2.5 decades, how has that state become so closely contested all of a sudden? Are we reaching a point where political factions are so entrenched that the rumors of secession around the country may actually become reality? And if not, how the heck are we going to get along? Thank you very much for being with us. You're kind of coming down to the final stage of your Virginia coverage for this gubernatorial race. Are you going to be happy to have it over and move on to something else? Or do you enjoy the strangeness of being the only person covering a election right now?
A little bit of both, I would say. I think that some of the Virginia coverage, since so many political reporters and so many people who work in politics live in DC or live in Virginia or live in Maryland, it's like all eyes are on this one race, and you have a press corps that's, big enough to cover a national election, zeroed in on one state. So there's something exciting about that, but there's also something a little bit tiring about it. So, mixed feelings when we're done.
Can you just explain? I mean, do they even have a reason why they do it in such a weird year? Is there an explanation to why they're in an odd numbered year and no other state is?
It's a good question. I'm not sure what the exact origins are, but, states get to set these things themselves. So Virginia and New Jersey are this year, and then you also have Louisiana and Kentucky that happen 2 years from now. And then most states actually do their governor elections in the midterm. So it's one of those federalism things where people are just all over the map.
Okay, so then I've learned something else too. And I guess I probably should have known Louisiana did theirs in a weird year, but we don't hear about them often. I didn't realize New Jersey's was also this year, maybe because it's not nearly as competitive. Is that why the Virginia one people are paying attention to?
That's right. I think that New Jersey, since it's a bluer state and people just expect it to go towards the Democrats, there's not as much attention paid to it as Virginia. And it's also a side effect of sort of Virginia being in the backyard of the entire, political media industry. Virginia's there. New Jersey's a little bit further away. And yeah, I think also Virginia's just a more competitive state. That's part of why you don't hear about Kentucky. You don't hear about Louisiana as much. You just have a state that's competitive, that's 1 year after the presidential election, and everybody uses it as this thermometer to sort of see, okay, what are Americans thinking in this, swingy, recently more blue state?
Right. Okay. So I do want to talk about Virginia, but as you were saying that, I thought to myself, but wait a second. If I had to name 2 governors of the state of New Jersey, which, yes, we all know in a presidential year is solid blue, but if I had to name governors from New Jersey, I think the only ones I could think of would be Republicans, Chris Christie and Christine Todd Whitman. So why is it are states just becoming, to be able to say that a state like New Jersey is obviously going to go to the Democrat or is strongly Democrat, when clearly in the past 2 decades, that has not necessarily been the case in that state? Has New Jersey just become solidly blue no matter what? Is that how other states are becoming, to where, they vote the same way in the presidential election as they do in the gubernatorial election? So that's question one. But the follow-up to that is, if that's the case, then why is the same not happening in Virginia?
Right. Both great questions. So on the first one, what you do see is that sort of decrease in split ticket voting. People are saying, you know what, I'm a Republican or a Democrat on the presidential level. I'm going to go Republican or Democratic down the entire rest of the ticket. So, yes, Chris Christie, he's a big personality. He's a memorable governor. But the most recent governor, or the current governor, is Phil Murphy. He's a Democrat. He's been a little bit more lower profile. People expect him to win again. And you just see more of this sorting, sort of the northeastern moderate Republicans that are, fiscally conservative, but sort of more socially liberal. That's sort of a breed of politician that's dying out a bit. They're having trouble surviving through primaries. They're having trouble sort of getting the Republican electorate behind them. And even if they get to the general election, sometimes Democratic voters are like, no, we just want a Democrat anyways. There are exceptions, but that's the general pattern. And you see the same thing with conservative Democrats in a lot of states. Democrats who said, okay, we're going to, give more money to people. We're going to be fiscally liberal, but we're going to be socially moderate and socially conservative. A lot of those candidates, even if they're getting nominated by state and local parties, are losing because Republican voters are saying, we just want Republicans. Now, why isn't that happening in Virginia is kind of the next question. And there's a couple reasons for this. One is that what we're seeing is this pendular swing. Right? This happens oftentimes after the presidential election. One party takes office. This year, it's the Democrats. Biden's in charge. Democrats have the House. They have the Senate. And that means Democratic voters say, okay, we're going to get some of what we want. We're a little bit less excited. They turn out less. Republicans see Democrats in the news passing laws, or at least trying to pass laws every single day. They get angry, they get excited, and they say, you know what, we're going to turn out. And independents usually say, whoever's in power, you know what, I think they're going just a little bit too far. So in a state like Virginia, in a state like Virginia, what happens is those three factors sort of come together, and we've seen that blue movement, but that pendulum swing backwards is enough to make it competitive.
So is this in Virginia, a referendum on the current governor, Ralph Northam, or is it a referendum on Biden, or is it a referendum still on Trump? Who are people voting for or against?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think depending on which side you talk to, you're going to get completely different answers on that. So if you talk to the Democratic side and you talk to McAuliffe and you hear how they're messaging, what they want to say is that Glenn Youngkin is Donald Trump in khakis. They want to say this is 2020 all over again. He supports all the same positions that Trump supports. That's kind of how they want to frame the race, is this is 2020 all over again. And why wouldn't they want to frame the race that way? Democrats won Virginia by about 10 points in 2020. And Youngkin has adopted a number of Trump's positions. If you talk to sort of the Youngkin campaign, they're trying to do this kind of balancing act. They're on this tightrope. They've taken some positions around vaccines, around, education and critical race theory and what can and should and shouldn't be taught. They're taking these positions that are designed to appeal to Trump's base. But they've nominated Youngkin, who is this, private equity executive. He sort of looks and sounds more like Mitt Romney than he does Donald Trump. And he's trying to say, okay, you know what? I want the old suburban Republicans and the new rural Republicans. I want them all sort of in one camp. And what this is about is the fact that Democrats in Virginia, aren't doing a great job and Biden's approval is down. So who it's about that's kind of a question that the results are going to answer, because you have these sides kind of talking out different realities, if that makes sense. If
it is this close in a state that has elected, that last elected a Democrat, Terry McAuliffe has also already been governor once in Virginia. They can only do it one time in a row, so he had to go away for a while. He's coming back. He's been elected to the governor's mansion once. They currently have a Democrat governor. Hillary Clinton carried Virginia. Joe Biden carried Virginia, I believe, Obama carried Virginia both times he ran. You can correct me if I'm wrong there.
You're right.
This is not a state that Democrats should be as concerned about, at least looking at the map. I believe the last Republican who was governor in Virginia was convicted of something. Didn't have a great time towards the end there. So what does it say about the Democrat Party in general that this is not as easy as the numbers suggest it should be?
Right. So I think what you're hitting on here is a big reason why there's so much heat around this election right now. I think that it's basically saying that Biden is losing people, and that the patterns that happen to almost every president in their first term and even in their second term are still happening to Biden. Many people thought that because of the events of January 6th and because Trump is still, politically active and making his voice heard, and, there's rumblings about him running again, that this time would be different. But really what we're seeing is that same sort of midterm and off-year recession. It means that some things about the Biden agenda are too much for, some more moderate voters. It means that, there's still a little bit of wiggle room maybe, right? That if Republicans nominate someone like Youngkin, suburbanites who don't like Trump may still be able to say, okay, I feel like this guy's a little bit different, right? There's still a little bit of wiggle room, even though straight ticket voting is sort of on the rise. But yeah, I think this is part of the life cycle. And it may also mean that the suburbs were uniquely allergic to Trump. And when other Republicans run, they're a little bit more competitive.
But so what does it say, though, that President Biden has come to the state to help Terry McAuliffe in his campaign? Because when you think about the last Democrat president, Barack Obama, he had higher approval ratings, arguably, but a lot of candidates who were running in midterms, especially, sort of distanced themselves from him, especially in places where it was the races were closer. There's not been a lot of distancing necessarily from Joe Biden when it comes to, is that because Terry McAuliffe is just a, devout Democrat Party guy? He used to chair the whole national committee. Or is it because Biden's numbers may be low, but he himself is not unpopular? How does that, like the calculus there doesn't make any sense to me. He's not doing well, his approvals are down, but we're still having him come in and help us.
Yeah. I've thought about this a little bit because it's interesting how they rolled it out too. Because you had the news break that the Obamas were going to campaign with McAuliffe first, and then Jill Biden was announced, before that, and Stacey Abrams was announced before that, and then Joe Biden was announced, and he was sort of staying on the sidelines for a long time. My guess is that they're just pulling out all of the stops at this point. They think, you know what, he's unpopular, but he's the president. Let's get him out there. The other thing that's interesting is that the suburbs of Northern Virginia, which have been growing steadily and becoming bluer, are different than the suburbs of almost everywhere else because it's a company town of the federal government. A lot of people are employed by the federal government or work in private businesses that are sort of, entangled with that and use that as part of their business. And I think that that's part of the reason that maybe Biden is a little bit less toxic there than he might be.
Is that where he came to campaign
else.
with him?
That's a good question. I have to double check. But this is one of the areas where, and the other thing about Biden is that he's also in his campaign sort of less toxic with rural voters than a lot of other Democratic voters are. He's somebody who, managed to hold the line in a lot of rural areas. He won Pennsylvania, he won Wisconsin. So if I had to guess of why Biden, why now, that would be that. But it's such an interesting dynamic you're naming, because the one other thing that I'll lodge in there is the shoe is kind of on the other foot. McAuliffe is running towards Biden, who's, a Democratic president who's, kind of struggling with his popularity. And Youngkin is running away from Trump as quickly as he possibly can. He's, trying to not appear with Trump, trying to distance himself. And is
he actively doing that? I mean,
thing.
I will plead great ignorance to the Virginia race. So I was not aware until a producer told me a little bit ago that there's Is Trump coming to help out? Has Youngkin asked him not to? Has McAuliffe? I'm sure McAuliffe has asked him to please come. But I mean, what is the level of involvement from former President Trump, and what is the level of enthusiasm to accept that involvement from Youngkin?
Right. So Trump has endorsed Youngkin. He has made his support clear. He said, "This is my guy. This is my candidate." And it was very interesting. I want to say a week or two ago, Steve Bannon, one of sort of Trump's aides / sort of associates, and Trump had this big virtual rally for Trump supporters. They had it in Virginia. They were excited about it. And Youngkin was not there. And he's just put physical distance between himself and the president at any opportunity. There's always the chance that he kind of reverses it. But really, so far in the campaign, his strategy has been, we're going to try to use the issues to keep the Trump fans on board, but we're not going to be close to Trump himself because we need those suburbanites.
So, I mean, Virginia is sort of, I think a lot of people people think of Virginia, they think like you're talking here about, that state that's next to D.C. And is so almost synonymous in some ways with Northern Virginia being D.C. But you're talking about a big state, which in a lot of ways kind of hits every single, maybe it doesn't have the California type voting demographic, but it really does hit almost every single other demographic. I think people think of Pennsylvania as being a little bit of a microcosm of America, and parts of Illinois but Virginia almost is more so, because it's not just that incredibly affluent Northern Virginia area, but you've got a very, very populated, working class, military-friendly, heavy area in the Tidewater down in the southeast part of the state. Virginia Beach is, I think, still the biggest city in Virginia. Sort of gets overlooked because of nobody thinks of it. You've got Richmond, which is government. Then you've got that whole, Wise County mountainous area that's a lot closer to the North Carolina rural areas that I'm familiar with. And then, it is still Virginia, which is also very similar to West Virginia. I mean, you've got a lot of kind of mountainous, coal industrial kind of mining communities in the far, far northwestern parts of the state. It's very much a microcosm of the country. So how, as you follow this story and you report on the governor's race there, how are you able in any way to extrapolate what parts of which messages are playing to, very rural southwestern Virginia versus southeastern Virginia versus that Joe Manchin type area up in the Northwest? How does it expand this out nationally? Because that's what everybody is watching it for, right?
Yeah. I think you're exactly right. And I actually grew up in West Virginia. So the sort of Appalachian area of Virginia feels familiar whenever I've been there. It's a place that I'm thinking like, oh yeah, this is, just like where I grew up. I think in that sort of region, that's where you're seeing some of Youngkin's most sort of Trump-ish messaging land. His campaign has talked a lot about sort of the big critical race theory snafus that are happening. Youngkin, it's a issue where, so earlier in the campaign, McAuliffe had this gaffe where he said that he thinks that, parents shouldn't be deciding on the curriculum that their kids say and all this stuff. And so when you think about what Youngkin wants to project, he wants to project that sort of message there. The cultural stuff that Trump used to sort of drive up the margins in rural areas all across the country, that's sort of what they want there. One interesting way to think about the division in Virginia, somebody else was telling me to this when when I was writing a recent story on it, is that there's really sort of two Virginias. There's a Virginia that's sort of, southern and has been there for a long time and is rural and that exists in, those rural counties you were talking about and some of the suburbs and things like that. And then there's a second Virginia, which is a Virginia of people who have moved in. And this is not just Northern Virginia. This is Richmond, like we were talking about. This is the whole Virginia Beach metro that we were talking about. People who have moved in for a job, who are, some sort of white collar worker and have moved directly in and don't really, think of the rural areas as Virginia. The Virginia that they know and that they've experienced is in those major metro areas. And that you have in Virginia this sort of cultural divide opening up between those two spaces. And one is not more or less legitimate than the other. Everyone in Virginia is a Virginian. But you have a situation where that sort of explains the bifurcated messaging. It explains why McAuliffe is talking about, COVID and why he's talking about, Youngkin is just like Trump and so on and so forth. He's speaking to, parts of Virginia that are different than other parts. And it's also the last thing, and definitely not least, it's important. Virginia is a state with a lot of diversity. If I'm remembering this correctly, around 1 in 5 Virginians are African American. And so this is a huge voting bloc. And you're seeing this also with McAuliffe bringing in Stacey Abrams, bringing in the Obamas, bringing in people who are going to try to help him with turnout with black voters, because that's another group that he needs inside and outside the cities all across the state.
Right. So, but Virginia also has, in addition to its diversity, it's got a lot of kind of segregated geographic diversity. So a lot of the African Americans in Virginia are Richmond, Petersburg, and then to the southeast, and then Southwest and Northern Virginia is a lot whiter. Is McAuliffe doing anything to reach out to the voters west of Richmond in the Roanoke area, those kind of more conservative rural areas? Because interestingly, I don't have the polls in front of me, but I think of the fact that there has been some polling done in West Virginia, especially because Joe Manchin's so integral to the budget bill that's being still thought about right now, that a lot of the economic policies that are being discussed within that bill are popular amongst West Virginian voters who are not necessarily Biden voters, but they, apparently like Joe Manchin enough to keep sending him back. They'll vote for Donald Trump on the same ticket, and and they don't support Joe Biden, but they like some of the proposals within that Democrats are pushing. But as you pointed out, damn well, culturally, those Buchanan County, Wise County, Dickerson County, far Western Virginians are not listening. They're very focused on the cultural thing. Have Democrats, has McAuliffe, have state delegate Democrats done any work at all in trying to win over some of those voters that arguably Biden won back, some of those voters that Joe Manchin is still able to win? Or are Virginia Democrats just sort of saying, you know what, we're going to get the vote out in Petersburg and Norfolk and Northern Virginia and screw the Western people?
Yeah. I mean, this is such an interesting part about coalition politics. So the short answer to your question is yes. So part of the sort of McAuliffe pitch in his message is, remember when I was governor, remember, the years 2013 to 2017, that was the Obama era. Like, we did concrete things for you. The economy got better. Your bottom line was better. That's a time when we had growth, talking about expanding basically the social safety net in various ways. This is something that's sort of a part of McAuliffe's message. And it's such an interesting tension, right? It's exactly what you're naming, which is that Democrats will say, we want to sort of make life better for people who have lower incomes, who live in rural areas, so on and so forth, in a concrete economic sense. And at the same time, those voters are still saying, yeah, but we're not on the same page with respect to cultural issues, with respect to immigration, with respect to abortion, with respect to, you name the other issues. And it's that tug of war. And the thing that I think is worth keeping an eye on is if you look in a county out there, if it's deeply red, but McAuliffe manages to shave off 3% or 5% or something like that, those are votes he doesn't have to get elsewhere. And that's what you're seeing that on both sides too. Not only are the sides trying to maximize sort of in their bastions, they're just trying to shave a little bit off of the opponents, right? They're trying to get just a little bit more here and there. Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it will be turnout, right? I mean, it's going to be who shows up in this strangely. I mean, I assume people in Virginia are sick and tired of seeing TV ads and seeing political ads, but who's more enthusiastic right now from what you can see? Are people on the right more pumped to show up to vote, to cast their vote for who Donald Trump told them to vote for? Or are people on the right disenfranchised because Trump has said, these elections are rigged, so boycott them? Are Democrats afraid of getting another Trump, so they're going to go and vote for McCall? Like, who's got the fire behind them right now?
Yeah, right now, the current polling data indicates some amount of greater enthusiasm on the Republican side. And I think one thing that's interesting, one of my, former bosses and mentors has said that, when you sort of strip away the policy positions for a second, strip away what people are saying for a second and watch what it is that they are actually doing. And it really seems, based on actions and who's coming to the state, that Democrats really are worried about turnout. They're worried that, people are that their voters are becoming complacent, and they're worried that their voters are, they're worried that their voters are not identifying Youngkin with Trump. I mean, Virginia was a D+10 state a year ago. The fact that it's close at all now means that turnout edge is favoring the Republicans. It's just a question of, is it enough? Is it, how's it going to go? How
does the fact that, are Democrats disenfranchised because they feel like, well, we've got a Democrat in the White House and we got a Democrat Senate and a Democrat House, and they haven't really done shit anyway. So, I'm being hyperbolic here, yeah. but how important is it for President Biden and the Senate and the House to pass something this week before Tuesday to show Virginia voters, hey, we're actually working? Do the national politics of that actually affect Virginia voters when it comes to the governor's race, or they're not related?
Yeah, I think the national politics do affect. And here's how I would frame it. I would frame it as more of a competence issue, right? If Democrats and swing voters think of Biden and what's going on as sort of competent governance, then they're happy, and then things are more likely to go well for Democrats. If they think that the wheels are coming off, they think that, oh my gosh, these people can't do anything or get anything done, like, oh geez, that's usually when things start to go bad. It's easy to forget this because of just how things have changed over time. But at this time in Obama's presidency, when it was 2009 and Republicans were sort of, just about to run up the score in the Virginia governor election, people really felt that Obama didn't, that the wheels were coming off, that he was, trying to get the ACA passed, but he was struggling with all the Democrats in Congress, and, was the individual mandate going to happen, and was the public option going to happen? And it was chaotic in that moment. And so I think chaos in governing is what makes it hard for the White House to hold on to power. In terms of whether you need to push Build Back Better, that's a hard question, because there are some historical examples where a president really fails to push their policies through, and then they get punished for it. And there's some where they succeed in pushing their policies through, and then they get punished for it. Bill Clinton in 1993, his big healthcare push failed. In 1994, the Democrats got really beat up. In, 2009, like we're just talking about, Obama is doing healthcare. He finally gets it passed in 2010, if I remember correct. And Democrats still get beat in 2010. So it's just hard to avoid that off-year penalty. But the through line there is that when people think the wheels are coming off and think that competence is at a low, that's when you lose the swing voters. That's when the Democrats get demoralized. That's when they say, okay, well, we voted for this, but, seems like it's not going great. And they get less motivated. And the Republicans say, oh, this is really not going great. And they turn out. And it's just this cycle. Happened to Trump, happened to Bush, happens to almost everyone.
So it sounds like it's inevitable for the Democrats to lose seats in 2022. And given that Democrats don't really have much of a margin in either the House nor the Senate, probably not going to be a great year for them. I can't help. I'm curious because I live in a state where the gubernatorial election's always the same year as the presidential election. So all the focus tends to be on the presidential election, and I don't get to see a gubernatorial election in the clear, so to speak. Are politics, and I don't mean, I'm trying to be as thoughtful with this as possible. I don't want to. Yeah. Are politics just as nasty on the state level as they are on the national level? And I say that because I know they're always nasty everywhere. Everybody acts like they're in kindergarten. So I get that they're always nasty, but the national dialogue is so inundated with people on one cable news network shilling for one party, it seems, and on another cable news network shilling for another party, that there's no such thing as thoughtful deliberation about who's the best for me when it comes to choosing who I'm going to vote for president. Local news, at least where in North Carolina, maybe because we're too busy paying attention to the national race, doesn't tend to be as, opinion driven. Is this a proxy in Virginia for how national races go, or is there a bit more civility at the state level with gubernatorial races? It's an interesting opportunity that you get to look at politics without necessarily having to have that Senate race on the same ticket, or those House races on the same ticket, or the presidential race on the same ticket. Do people behave differently when the lawyers aren't in the room?
Yeah, it's a great question. I feel like I'm being so, I don't know, fatalistic at times, this conversation so far. There are a couple moments in history where that midterm penalty gets reversed and where things are different. And there are some races, I remember last time around in the Utah governor race, the two candidates took out an ad together talking about, right, we really want to agree constructively. We want to do this better. And in some cases where you have that rare blue state Republican, or where you have that rare red state Democrat, you see a difference in what the rhetoric.
Granted, I don't think the Democrat who was running for governor in Utah had a snowball's chance in hell, and he probably knew that.
True.
So he made himself. He made a point to make a statement instead. But are they nicer here at the state level than they are nationally, or no?
I mean, this is it is hard to be meaner than it is on the national level. But one trend that we're seeing that I think affects a lot of why people feel so bad about politics is the decline of local news. It's the decline of a state focus. A lot of local news outlets are going out of business. They don't have, a funding model that can work. A hedge fund maybe buys them up and sort of rips the whole thing apart. And you have this sort of increase in stakes of national elections too. People feel this existential dread. And I think that filters down to other races too. They feel, oh my God, whoever wins the presidency, it has these huge consequences. And so then they think, oh geez, I better give my, presidential candidate allies in the Senate, allies in the House. well, I, definitely want the gubernatorial candidate to govern like my, favorite presidential candidate. And they just go tick down, 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 down the ballot the same way. And so I think that, sometimes you see these sort of glimmers of more constructive things. You see a time where a state level candidate, especially governors can do this from time to time, zeroes in on an issue that hasn't yet been nationalized. But, part of the reason our politics have become so nasty is because they've become so top down. And I don't think state politics have escaped this, and state legislators.
Even in a state where they don't have that same, I mean, again, I talk about North Carolina too much, but I have to because I'm here. I'm in a state where twice Donald Trump carried the state, and both times a Democrat won the governor's mansion on the same ballot. I think one of only two governors, Democrats, who want to win statewide on the same ballot that Trump won on. So I see it as, that's why I asked the question, and I wonder how much being face to face with these candidates makes them behave more. Or in Virginia, do they not get out and talk to voters face to face when they're running for governor at all?
It's an interesting situation because, so if you think about the three levels beneath the presidency that are the most powerful, Senate, House, and governor. Right. The governor candidates do have the most leeway. If you look at those results, like you're saying in North Carolina, you do get those split results more. You do get more of those candidates who are able to go and, make a connection with voters or brand themselves differently or have that sort of long career that's helpful. And people do recognize, okay, this is a governor. They're going to fix potholes. They're not going to Washington. They're going to my state capital. So there's a little bit more leeway that happens there. And frankly, that's part of the reason why Virginia is close. It's because Youngkin is able to self-brand in a way that the National Republican Party can't. He's able to say, okay, I'm trying to keep this person at an arm's length, right? But I have to tell you, I live in California now, and we just went through a recall election, and it was a very interesting situation because at the beginning of the recall, it looked close. And then Gavin Newsom, the current Democratic governor, said, okay, if I lose, you're going to get Larry Elder. Larry Elder's exactly like Trump. And then the Democrats got engaged, and it was basically a repeat of the 2020 result. It was this situation where in a state election where there are so many issues that are, different from California anywhere else, than anywhere else. You have wildfires, you have budget issues that are different here. You had just a replay of the national results. And, depending on your perspective, maybe you think that's a good thing, maybe you think that's a bad thing. But my point is that it's so easy for national politics just to shape everything. And it's just hard for candidates to get out of that box.
Are there any undecided voters left? I mean, I'm asking you obviously about Virginia, but about the whole country, because you clearly report on more than just Virginia. So are there really, when we hear the word, the term independent, and I know there's been a lot of arguing about this, when we hear the term independent, I don't believe that people who identify as independent are actually moderates. A lot of times those people who are independent are further right than the Republican Party. They don't think the Republicans are far enough right for them, or they don't think the Democrats are far enough left for them. So independent doesn't mean moderate. So I ask, are there moderate voters left still? Are there still people in Virginia or in California or anywhere in the country who are sitting there and deliberately making a decision based on who they think will be better? Or have we just gotten to a place where we are tribal and we're going to choose who we're going to wear our jersey and show up and turnout is the key?
Oh, well, first optimistic note will hit. There are swing voters. There are people who are willing to decide. And I would think of them as sort of being in a couple camps. There are true swing voters who oftentimes are less tuned into the news. They're not, political junkies. They're normal people living their lives who, when an election rolls around, they say, okay, I got to figure out some stuff. I got to figure out who to decide. I'm not really on the red team or the blue team. I got to figure this out. And that is a pivotal group of voters. There's a second group also that I would say are cross-pressured voters. They're voters who maybe have had strong partisan loyalties in the past, but are looking at the ground changing underneath of them and are sort of reevaluating. And you can see these voters on the left and on the right. You can see them amongst, you could call them populist Republicans. These are voters that Obama won, that oftentimes they're, working class. Sometimes they're white, sometimes they're, not. But there's a segment of the Republican electorate that used to be sort of Union Democrats who don't like sort of, top-down supply-side economics, but do like where Republicans are on cultural issues. There's cross-pressured Democrats as well, people who say, oh, I really don't want my taxes to go up, but I think that the Democrats are right when they talk about issues of race or issues of abortion, and they feel cross-pressured and they've been moving left. So you have sort of these distinct groups. It's not just people who are, okay, I'm moderate, I'm deciding at the end. You have blocks that are moving between parties because those parties are moving, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, but you've also, interestingly, because you've done some work and talked and written some about the secession movements in the country. I mean, obviously, hopefully they're not going to happen, but there's been more talk in the past year or so that I think I've seen in my lifetime of people thinking, I think, 50% of Trump voting Republicans believe that we should separate the country into half by ideology. And I don't think it's as high with Democrats, but it's high enough to freak me out. I think it's in the 40s amongst Democrats who feel the same way. It sounds like what you just said would suggest that we couldn't really split ourselves into two camps anyway if we wanted to, because a lot of people don't really fit into either one very neatly. So what the fuck is going on, David?
Right.
Why do we think we're divided in half if we're not really?
Yeah. So the secession numbers you named are just wild. I've got a couple of them here. So in the southern United States, 66% of Republicans say, maybe it'd be a good idea for us to have our own region break off and leave and move elsewhere. Know what happened last time you tried that, fuckers. But it's wild because, like you're saying, it's Democrats too, because in the Pacific region, in California, Oregon, and Washington, it's half of Democrats who say, 47% to be exact, who say, you know what, maybe it would be a good idea if we just had our own place and we just had our own whole situation.
But those numbers, don't they suggest that perhaps that 40% of Democrats are the 40% of Democrats who do who ideologically are aligned with the left all the time, and perhaps there's 60% who maybe like me, I mean, everybody knows my bias is here, I align with Democrats on a lot of stuff, but there's a lot of shit that I wish we'd get our house in order on, so I don't want to secede because I'd be in a, and perhaps there are Republicans who are that way too. Whose fault is it that people think that they have to vote for Glenn Youngkin because Glenn Youngkin's the one that's going to keep critical race theory out of my schools? Meanwhile, they also know that perhaps his economic policies won't help me. But I'm going to, we're clearly choosing our team based on only half of the team's message, right? We like the Democrats because we like their offense, but their defense sucks, but we like their offense more, so we're going to be Democrats,
Yeah, whose fault is it is a fascinating question. I have a couple thoughts on it. To some extent, it is the politicians. One thing that we've learned is that, if you're a normal voter, you don't think about politics all the time. You don't think, you aren't following every up and down of Congress. You figure out who you align with more, and oftentimes you trust those people. So when someone who's a Democrat or Republican says, this election has existential stakes, this is, something where, our lives and our, world is going to be totally taken apart if the other side wins, the voters believe them. They've got other things that they're doing in their life. They're not, studying up and saying, well, maybe it's, that they believe the people they trust who are aligned with them and in their party. So to some degree, this is the fault of politicians who, use escalating rhetoric. And it's to some degree, it's a little bit of a reflection of reality. And I want to be careful when I say this, because there are big differences between what Republicans and Democrats do in office. There are big differences in, what they want to try to do. And so I think to some degree, like the hair on fire, everything, the world is going to end if the other side wins. I don't necessarily think that that's always warranted, but there
it's
are
effective.
real differences. There are real differences though. So if we're thinking about how would we bring down the temperature? Another good question is, what's the right temperature to have our politics at? Like there are.
Can we turn it down to 1? I would be happy to turn it down to 1. I mean, ironically, a lot of the things that heat people up the most are usually the things that at least Congress doesn't have any say in the first place, I mean, whether it be critical race theory fears or social, a lot of social issues, these are rarely things that Congress has much of a role in. They don't have a role. The federal government doesn't have a role in what is taught in schools. They shouldn't have a role in who marries who. Those are usually state level issues. And if they do go federal, it's a Supreme Court thing. And they solve it the way they should. But those are the things that people don't pay attention. Those are the things that get people heated are the social issues. Yeah. And the things that don't seem to get people heated tend to be the things that have the most impact on their lives, like the money in politics thing, because it's boring, nobody wants to talk about it, or gerrymandering, it's boring, nobody wants to talk about it, or tax policy. It's complicated, and all I want to hear is that my taxes are going down. So is it just the fact that we now live in 2021 in an echo chamber, and both the media and politicians are going to squeak their wheels the loudest to hopefully get that grease, and we're just screwed?
I mean, well, a couple things on this. I think that one of the developments, you're exactly right, is that a lot of the developments that are dividing people are not things that have political solutions. One of the reasons our politics is so overheated is because the cultural battle lines are increasingly lining up with the political battle lines, things that are fraught, race, religion, people's, perception of where they are, in terms of income and class, educational levels, what kind of job. It's a lot of politics is organized by who you dislike as much as it's organized by, what you want from your government. One thing I found this, I was looking back on this data, and I actually thought about this podcast, let me pull it up real quick here. But one thing that you notice is that Republicans and Democrats stereotype each other in this completely wild and different way. If you ask Democratic voters, okay, what percentage of Republicans are over age 65? What percent of Republicans are hyper wealthy? What percent of Republicans are evangelicals? They always overestimate it. If you ask, Republicans, okay, what percent of Democrats are atheists? What percent of Democrats are LGBT? What percent of Democrats are, and you can go down the line, they always overestimate it. So in terms of,
and both sides, by the way, think the other side's evil as hell, right? Hates America, wants to like actively do things to destroy us. That's obviously the motivation of both sides, to hurt us, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. That's what people see, and that's what people think when you have these wide cultural chasms. In terms of what we can do, I mean, I have my just 2 or 3 things that I think of. One is people can get out more. And actually, and not just see people who are different from them from 3 blocks away and count that as, being somewhere else, and seeing the other side of America, but have conversations that actually matter. One interesting thing is that some of the social science research has found that if you have a conversation that has sort of an empathetic part to it, where people are talking about ways in which they've struggled, they're more likely to be open to sort of changing their opinion and thinking through something in a way that's different from somebody else. I've noticed in my own work with some survey data I found is that if you're a Republican who has friends who are Democrats, you're less likely to believe a conspiracy theory than a Republican who only has friends who are Republicans. And the same goes on the left too. If you're a Democrat who has Republican friends, you might push back on the conspiracy theory more. If you're a Democrat that only lives in your bubble, you're more likely to believe some wild conspiracy about the other side.
That's why my Democrat friends hate me, because I have Republican friends and they think I'm crazy for doing it.
Yeah, and it's wild. It's that exposure is. I love the concrete. Helpful, you know,
and I have to say, in the year, and I hope you come back to this at the end when I ask the last question. But I don't think I have heard anybody in the year and a half plus that we've been doing this show actually have a concrete solution or an idea. Usually, it's usually, we just need to listen more. We need to be open-minded. I mean, people have better answers to that. But to actually go out, get out of the house, and have conversations, I appreciate that. There's actually an active thing we can do. We did get a lot of questions in for you, but I have run my mouth longer. I was going to say longer than usual, but I've run it all the time. So we won't be able to get to too many of them. But I want to get at least to this one. Nolan from South Boston, Virginia. Rural voters have lost a lot of power in our state. Is there any chance of coming back? I'm assuming he's asking, is there any chance that rural voters will get power back? South Boston, pretty rural, kind of ish.
Yeah, I mean, Massachusetts is a state that's, you said South Boston?
No, I said South Boston, Virginia. South Boston, Virginia.
Oh, okay.
So
gotcha.
an actual,
I was like, how is South Boston rural?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think this opportunity, if you're politically aligned with Youngkin, is probably the best opportunity for Republicans to gain power, in a decade in the state level at Virginia. One thing to think about, though, and this is something else I was thinking about when I was just reading the title of this show, is that not all power is in the state. I think one thing that can happen that can sort of take some of the pressure down and take the temperature down in our politics is if somebody gets involved locally and picks one thing that they want to change and one thing that's in their community. I obviously want people to read about national politics because I write about it for the Washington Post. But I think, if you spend an hour each week going to a local meeting that has to do with what's happening in your town, in your city, something in your school board, you're going to have more accumulated power if you did that for, half an hour to an hour a week. That's going to give you more of a say necessarily than, clicking around on polling averages for an extra hour. As much as I love polling averages and have contributed to that world, there's different levels.
You're part of the problem, damn it. No, I'm kidding.
I hope not. Yeah.
Okay, Nolan, Halifax County Commission is calling you, according to David here. Jill from San Jose. Are we at risk of heading towards a civil war? I'm gonna assume that's hyperbolic, but let's hope, Jill, God, please, that we're not actually at the risk of heading towards a civil war. I'm going to change your question and ask David how close we are towards becoming more. Are we closer to fighting harder, or is there a turnaround at any point where it cools off?
Yeah. If I had to guess, fighting harder. One thing to keep in mind when you're looking at that data about, people want to secede, some of that is there's a, fancy technical term for it called expressive responding, which is basically that if you give a Republican or a Democrat in a poll the chance to stick it to the other side, no matter how crazy your question is, they're going to stick it to the other side, right? So it's not necessarily true that 66% of Southern Republicans or 47% of Pacific Northwest Democrats, have guns and are ready to, take them out and actually fight a war. Some of that is going to be expressive. I would say we're at a very fragile moment. because of what happened on January 6th, because of the whole Capitol insurrection, and because of, Trump continuing to claim falsely that he won the 2020 election. There's a lot of room for things to go off the rails pretty fast in the next couple of elections. So, back to pessimism, David. I think everybody, like they said in Jurassic Park, hold on to your butts. Like this is gonna be quite a thing in the next couple of years. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to do one more because I find it fascinating. Tim from Alexandria, Virginia, must not have heard every episode of this podcast because I've answered it a few times, but I'm going to ask the expert. Tim asks, David, I see Youngkin signs everywhere. Is that a good tell for candidate support?
No. I completely understand it because people see the signs, they see them everywhere. It's something that they, think, oh man, it must happen. It's very concrete, it's visual. No, you're better off looking at the polling, at what candidates do. Candidates themselves will even encourage their supporters to get more yard signs. Different amounts of yard signs will be in different places. You've got better indicators that are free, public, and online for where this race is going, and it's tight. So if you care, you should vote.
And Tim, if you live in Alexandria, then I imagine that there are more Youngkin signs than there are Youngkin voters in that particular part of the state. I mean, as a former candidate myself, I kind of get it. When I started running, I wanted signs, and all my campaign people said, nobody votes based on a sign. Stop caring. The only people who care about the signs are the candidate. And I was like, that's stupid. They mean so much. And we spend a lot of money on signs. And lo and behold, it didn't mean a damn thing. And every time I see a corner that's got 10, 20 of the same sign on the corner, I think I'm clearly close to where this particular candidate drives every day because their campaign staff. So Tim, maybe you live near where Youngkin actually drives, and his campaign team has very carefully placed those signs there so he can see them on his way to the office every single day. David Byler, thank you very much for enlightening me on this whole Virginia thing, but also for a word of the week, if not the month for me, expressive responding. I am fascinated by it because I knew there had to be a term for something like that, and I'm thrilled that you told us about it. So, is it expressive responding or expressive response? What'd you call it?
Yeah, you can say it's either one. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I feel so much smarter now. I hope that's on a Trivial Pursuit quiz or a New York or a crossword puzzle or something at some point. You can read all of David's writing about the Virginia race up at least until Tuesday and probably several days beyond the after effects, the aftermath of the Virginia election this coming Tuesday. You can read all of his bylines in the Washington Post, and also a whole bunch of really fun, nerdy stuff that I like with data analysis, and he does a lot of stuff on demographics. I'm sure you're going to be getting into gerrymandering. Maybe we'll have you come back and talk about my least favorite thing on the planet, gerrymandering, especially when my state somehow miraculously gerrymanders our new district as well, because it's coming. So please come back and help talk me off the ledge with that. But until then, David, how the heck are we going to get along?
Well, first off, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it. How we're going to get along? I think care about your local area. Don't just focus on national politics because you can do something. You are not powerless when the other party wins. You can improve your life and your world. I would say get out, talk to people, and have real conversations with them that, get deep in there because that's how they're going to build empathy for you and you're going to build empathy for them. And I think, just find if you can find some sort of source of meaning in your life that's outside of politics, whatever that looks like for you, I think that's good because we live in a 50-50 country and somebody you don't like is going to be governing you half the time. And that's just the reality of our world.